As dawn breaks over a sleeping city, the only sound is the soft hum of tires on damp asphalt. A sleek black sedan idles under dim streetlights. Inside, Richard Ward, a billionaire used to control, grips the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turn white. Behind him, in the back seat, sits Mia Jackson, young, quiet, hopeful, just hired to be the household maid, promised a new life, a chance to send money home. As the streetlights flicker and the car pulls away, Mia's shadowed face disappears into darkness. A distant door closes, and silence. Who is she really working for? What does Richard want from her? Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. 6 months ago, Mia arrived at the Ward estate, a sprawling mansion perched on a hill outside the city. She came with little more than a suitcase and a single photograph of her younger sister, waiting back home. On her first night, Richard showed her a narrow room tucked under the staircase, said it was quaint. He handed her a uniform and told her where to sleep and when to wake. For a few days, things felt manageable. Early mornings polishing floors, late evenings washing dishes, and the distant clink of crystal glasses from the master bedroom. Mia reminded herself this was for her sister, for the future. But over time, subtle shifts began. Richard's voice grew sharper. When she stumbled cleaning the dining table, a single misplaced wine glass, he snarled, "Do you even know how to serve properly?" His eyes flickered, cold and empty. He began checking in on her at midnight. Once, he asked why the bathroom mat smelled damp. Another time, he told her to leave the bathroom door open while showering. "So we know you're still alive." Mia's heart pounded every time she heard footsteps approaching down the long marble hallway. She started sleeping with only one ear on the floorboards, waiting. One rainy evening, after the household had gone to bed, Mia crept down the marble stairs, her uniform clutched in her trembling hands. She pressed her ear against the heavy front door, no footsteps. Outside, the gate was chained, but the lock looked old. With a sudden decision born of desperation, she slipped the chain loose and pushed the gate open. Rain poured as she ran into the night, tears washing away months of fear. She didn't stop until the mansion lights faded behind her. For 3 nights, she hid in an abandoned warehouse, too scared to call family. Finally, a neighbor who had seen her running in slippers offered her refuge and called a charity for help. Today, Mia is free. The mansion stands empty. Richard Ward is behind bars. Evidence of scarred wrists, emaciated frame, silent surveillance footage that shows the long nights she spent tied in a corridor corner, starving. According to press reports, a real maid once died after similar abuse. She weighed barely 24 kilograms and slept on a concrete floor with her arm tied to a railing. Those facts made people in other rich cities look the other way, but Mia's escape made them stare. Now she volunteers at an outreach center, helping other domestic workers who come looking for hope. She keeps the photograph of her sister in a small frame on her dresser, a reminder of why she ran. If you were in Mia's shoes, tired, invisible, afraid, would you have walked out into the rain? Would you have stayed silent or broken free? How do you feel knowing this could happen behind grand gates and velvet curtains? Share your thoughts below. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. But before the truth unfolds, there are questions that still hang in the air like quiet echoes, asking to be understood. Why does Mia leave the mansion every evening at exactly 5:55 p.m., never a minute earlier, never a minute later? She walks fast, head down, clutching that worn brown envelope close to her chest. What's inside it? And why does she never stop to ask anyone for help, even when her eyes are swollen from crying? People saw her pass through the same dim alleyway each night, shoulders tight, breath quick, as if she were racing against something only she could feel. What was she running from? What was she trying to protect? And then there are the legal documents she carries everywhere, folded, creased, guarded like something that determines her entire future. Why would a maid need such papers? Why did she never let them out of her sight? Some said they saw her reading them under streetlights, lips trembling silently, as if the words were too heavy for her heart to carry. Others noticed how she never smiled, how her expression always looked burdened, as though she'd lived a lifetime of sorrow inside just a few short years. What was she hiding from the world? And more importantly, who was she hiding from? Grace's days began long before the sun even considered rising. She moved through the mansion like a soft breath, careful not to disturb anyone, careful not to take up space. Her routines were quiet and disciplined. Mop the foyer before the house stirred, polish the banisters until her reflection wavered on the surface, prepare Henry's coffee exactly the way he liked it. 2 sugars, no conversation. She owned only 2 dresses, washed nightly, and hung carefully beside her small window, the threads thinning more each week. And yet, despite her exhaustion, she always found ways to help others. The gardener whose back was giving out, the delivery boy who struggled with heavy crates, the elderly neighbor who once forgot her keys. Her kindness was steady, gentle, almost stubborn, but behind her tired smile lived a sadness she never named. She feared the dark, flinching whenever the hallway lights flickered, as if memories hid in every shadow. Henry Ward moved through life with the confidence of a man who believed he had already solved every problem worth solving. Cold, precise, and endlessly efficient, he navigated his empire, real estate, tech investments, luxury rentals. With the same emotional distance he showed the people who worked beneath his roof. To him, empathy was a distraction, something that slowed down productivity. He saw struggle as weakness, convinced no one carried burdens heavier than his own lifetime of pressure and expectations. He kept everyone at arm's length, employees, partners, even family. When Grace brought his morning coffee, he barely glanced up. When she asked if he needed anything else, he simply said, "Stay out of the way." And yet, there were moments, tiny, unintended moments, where his gaze lingered on her a little too long, trying to read something he didn't understand. Still, the mansion itself held small clues about the storm quietly growing inside Grace. There was a framed photo she kept hidden beneath her mattress, wrapped in a cloth as though the world might damage it if it ever saw the light. Sometimes she touched the glass with a tenderness that revealed more than words ever could. In her Bible, tucked between wrinkled pages, she kept a single document, folded, smoothed, folded again, its edges worn from constant handling. She never let anyone near it, not even the house staff who admired her gentle spirit. And some nights, when she returned from her strict 5:55 p.m. errand, her eyes were wet, her breath shallow, as though she had just walked away from a truth too sharp to hold. Those quiet signs became questions that lingered in the air between her and the viewers watching this unfold. Who was in that hidden photo? Why did she guard that document like her entire life depended on it? And what happened in those dark moments that made her fear nightfall more than anything else? Every answer was tied to a past she couldn't escape and a future she was desperately trying to protect. Henry first noticed the pattern on a Thursday evening. Grace signed out at exactly 5:55 p.m., clutching her worn bag, and that same brown envelope pressed against her chest. Something about the precision unsettled him. That night he sat alone in his dark SUV at the edge of the driveway, engine off, watching her silhouette move quietly down the hill. She didn't look back once. When she turned onto the main road, Henry switched on the ignition and followed at a careful distance, unsure why he needed answers, but unable to ignore the way curiosity tugged at him. Grace walked with purpose, her steps quick, her shoulders drawn tight, taking streets he had only ever seen from a plane window. The deeper she moved into the city, the more Henry realized how little he knew about the world she lived in and how much he had overlooked her presence in his own home. Grace stopped at a rusted bus stop, where 2 flickering bulbs struggled to stay alive. She stood under the dimmest corner, hugging herself against the wind, her breath visible in the chilling air. When the old city bus screeched to a halt, she boarded without hesitation, disappearing among tired night workers and mothers carrying sleeping children. Henry parked across the street, waited a few seconds, then followed the bus through tight turns and narrow lanes he had never driven before. The city felt different from behind his tinted windows, raw, unpredictable, full of lives he had dismissed without a thought. Grace stepped off the bus 20 minutes later and walked deeper into a maze of streets where the buildings leaned close together, their windows cracked, their walls marked by years of struggle. Henry stayed far enough behind to remain unseen, but close enough to feel the weight of every step she took. Each turn Grace made tighten the knot in Henry's stomach. She slipped past a row of shuttered shops, crossed a cracked bridge, and moved into a neighborhood he didn't even know existed. Streetlights were rare here, The air seemed heavier, colder. Children played barefoot near broken fences, adults huddled around small fires for warmth, and stray dogs wandered silently between dumpsters. Grace didn't slow down. She walked with a familiarity that startled him, weaving through the twisting paths as though she had walked them 100 times before. Henry found himself gripping the steering wheel the same way he had earlier that morning, sensing there was something about her life he had never imagined, something deeper than long shifts and worn dresses. He began to realize that every assumption he had made about her had been shaped by his own distance from the world she came from. Grace eventually stopped beneath a dim street lamp, the light flickering like a heartbeat. She took a deep breath, wiped her eyes, and looked around as if making sure no one was watching. Henry leaned forward, eyes narrowed, trying to understand what weighed so heavily on her shoulders that she carried it alone every night. She clutched the brown envelope tighter, steadying herself before taking a final turn into a narrow passage tucked between two abandoned buildings. Henry pulled over, his pulse thudding in his ears, trying to keep sight of her as she moved toward the shadows. And then, she disappeared into an alley he didn't recognize. Henry stepped out of the SUV slowly, the door clicking shut behind him with a sound that felt far too loud in the quiet night. The cold air bit at his skin as he followed the narrow path where Grace had vanished moments earlier. His polished shoes fell out of place on the uneven ground, crunching against gravel and broken glass. Shadows shifted across the walls, long and wavering, as though the night itself was watching him. Somewhere ahead, he heard the soft whisper of children, tiny voices, hushed and cautious, followed by footsteps scurrying deeper into the alley. Henry hesitated, suddenly aware of how unfamiliar everything felt, but curiosity and something heavier pulled him forward. A faint glow flickered in the distance, barely visible between the cracked bricks of a forgotten building. It was the warm, wavering light of a candle. Henry approached slowly, the city's silence wrapping tightly around him. Inside the structure, through a broken doorway, he saw movement, not dangerous, but desperate. As he stepped closer, his breath caught. There was Grace, kneeling beside a crying woman whose shoulders trembled uncontrollably. Grace held the woman's hands, whispering softly, her voice steady despite the exhaustion etched into her face. She wiped the woman's tears with her sleeve, comforting her the way a mother comforts a frightened child. In another corner, Grace tended to an elderly man lying on a makeshift mattress, checking his forehead, adjusting a thin blanket, speaking to him with the gentleness Henry had never once seen in himself. From her worn bag, the same one she took from the mansion every evening, she pulled out pieces of bread, small containers of broth, and tiny bottles of medicine. She handed them out one by one, making sure everyone received something, even if it meant she went without. Henry watched, stunned. For years he had believed that he understood hardship, that his long days in boardrooms and endless pressure made him resilient. But here, in this dimly lit ruin, surrounded by people surviving on scraps and faith, he realized how little he truly knew. His wealth, his influence, his power, none of it mattered in this place. He felt his chest tighten with something he rarely experienced, guilt. And beneath that guilt, an unsteady fear. He suddenly felt like a stranger walking through a chapter of his own city that he had spent his life ignoring. Grace continued moving, consoling, helping. As she knelt beside a young boy shivering under a thin blanket, Henry noticed the brown envelope at her feet. Its contents had spilled halfway out. Papers. He squinted, stepping closer without making a sound. Hospital forms. Names he didn't recognize. Dates. Diagnoses. A list of treatments. And then he heard Grace's whisper, soft, full of a promise she could barely afford to make. Don't worry. Mama will find help. Her voice cracked slightly at the word mama, and Henry felt something shift inside him. He couldn't look away. The weight of everything he didn't know pressed against his chest. Why was she here? Who were these people to her? And why did she take on their pain as though it were her own? The glow of the candle wavered, stretching shadows across the walls, and Henry stood frozen in the doorway, closer to the truth than ever before, yet still unable to grasp the full story. Grace moved deeper into the room, whispering to someone he couldn't see. Her shoulders trembled just slightly, but she kept going, kept comforting, kept giving. Henry watched her like someone witnessing a world he never knew existed, one shaped by sacrifice, by quiet battles, by a strength he had never seen in boardrooms or corporate empires. The final truth lingered just out of reach, waiting in the shadows of that broken building, but Grace wasn't ready to reveal it yet. And Henry wasn't prepared for what he was about to learn. Henry stepped deeper into the broken building, each footstep soft, cautious, as though he feared disturbing the fragile world unfolding in front of him. The candlelight flickered across Grace's face as she knelt beside a small table made from stacked crates. Her hands trembled while she sorted through a pile of papers, more hospital forms, treatment notes, signatures. Henry leaned closer, and in that moment the truth washed over him like a cold wave. Dialysis forms, pediatric consent documents, a child's name printed at the top. Grace whispered to the papers as if speaking to someone she loved more than her own breath. Then she reached for a small photograph tucked at the bottom of the stack, wiping it gently with her sleeve. It was a boy, thin, smiling softly, with eyes that looked too wise for his age. Her son, the child she never mentioned. The child she was fighting to keep alive with a salary that barely covered her bus fare. Grace set the photo beside a metal bowl of donated rice, closing her eyes as she whispered a quiet prayer. Henry watched her shoulders shake, watched the exhaustion pour out of her in tiny, controlled sobs she tried to hide from everyone around her. He realized the food she handed out each night, the warm bread, the small containers of stew, were meals she cooked for him earlier in the day. She didn't keep a single piece for herself. Every bite went to the people who depended on her, even as she was drowning beneath hospital debts and impossible choices. In another corner, Henry noticed a page she kept pressed in her Bible. A list, dozens of names scribbled in worn ink, written with care. People to help tomorrow. She added another name with slow, trembling hands, her lips moving as though promising each one of them something she could barely afford to give. The sight hollowed Henry. His throat tightened as he stood frozen in the doorway, watching a woman he had dismissed as just a maid carry burdens heavier than any he had ever known. Grace moved to an elderly woman struggling to breathe and held her close, whispering, "You're safe. You're not alone." Then she wiped her own tears quickly, forcing a small smile before turning to help a young veteran who limped toward her. Every part of her was worn down, her clothes, her body, her spirit, but she continued as if she owed the world more than it had ever owed her. Henry felt his chest collapse inward, the weight of his ignorance pressing against his ribs. He had built entire towers, entire empires, yet never felt the kind of courage she displayed here in the dim glow of a single candle. And as he watched her whisper one last prayer over the list of names, he understood something he had been blind to his whole life. "This woman I ignored," he murmured to himself, "has more heart than anyone I know." Henry drove back to the mansion in silence, the city lights blurring past him as though the world itself had shifted. The house felt colder than usual when he entered, its wide hallways suddenly echoing with every moment he had ignored Grace's quiet presence. He barely slept. At sunrise, he sat at his desk with hospital forms spread before him, tracing each line Grace had carried with trembling hands. By noon, he had made calls, doctors, specialists, financial officers, signing papers he should have signed long ago. The next morning, he asked Grace to step into his office. She walked in slowly, her eyes lowered, fingers twisting anxiously, convinced she was about to lose the small job sustaining the battle she fought alone. Henry stood, unable to hold her gaze for long. He simply handed her a sealed envelope and stepped back. Her hands shook as she opened it, expecting a termination notice. Instead, she found her son's full medical coverage approved and paid in advance, transportation arranged, treatment scheduled. Beneath it lay documents for a small home donated in her name and a trust fund established for her son's future, funds she would never have to return. Grace's breath caught. Her knees wobbled. Tears spilled before she could stop them. She pressed a hand to her mouth, whispering her son's name as if checking whether she was awake. Henry looked away, blinking hard, because something inside him cracked the moment he saw her break under the weight of relief she had never dared to hope for. She tried to speak, but no sound came. Instead, she stepped back, overwhelmed, her tears falling onto the envelope she held like a lifeline. Henry finally met her eyes, his voice low, unsteady, stripped of every wall he ever hid behind. "You should never have carried this alone," he said. Grace cried harder, and Henry felt his own tears rise, not from guilt anymore, but from the human truth he had ignored for far too long. And as Grace held the documents to her chest, the narration softens, settling into the kind of truth that lingers long after a story ends. Sometimes the people we overlook carry the greatest battles. Sometimes the quietest hearts carry the loudest pain. And sometimes kindness is hidden right in front of us, waiting for someone to finally see it. Henry learned that day that compassion is not weakness. It is the greatest form of strength. And Grace learned that even in a world full of heavy shadows, there are still moments of unexpected light, moments that remind us that we are not meant to walk through our hardest nights alone. So ask yourself as you sit with this story, who around you might be fighting a silent battle you've never noticed? And if it were you, if you were the one carrying a burden too heavy to name, what kind of heart would you pray would reach out to you? As we close this journey, ask yourself something honest. What would you have done if you were in Henry's place that night? Would you have kept driving? Or would you have followed the quiet footsteps of someone you overlooked for too long? Do you believe people hide more pain than they show, carrying battles behind tired eyes, hiding heartbreak behind practiced smiles? Think about the people you pass every day, the ones who never complain, the ones who always say they're fine even when their world is falling apart. Have you ever met someone stronger than they looked? Someone whose courage lived in the quiet things they did, rather than the words they spoke? If this story touched your heart, make sure to like the video, share it with someone you care about, and subscribe for more emotional, timeless stories every day.